Let's continue with some concepts in the economics of climate change. If emissions of greenhouse gases create a negative externality, then reducing those emissions creates a positive externality. The problem with that, of course, is that those who are reducing their emissions have to pay some sort of price to do that. They have to give up something, or maybe they have to make some costly investments. The benefits of reducing those greenhouse gas emissions are largely going to go to other people. This situation fits into the idea that we saw earlier of a public good. And why is it like a public good? Well, let's just remember the characteristics of a public good. If we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, then everybody in the world benefits from that to some extent. And as with a public good, one person's benefit doesn't reduce the amount that others get to consume or get a benefit from either. And nobody can be excluded from those benefits, even if they haven't contributed. So this is a situation where we have a free rider problem. We've got, in fact, a very serious free rider problem, because not only do we have a situation in which we've got a public good problem, but people have to make voluntary contributions. If you think of a public good, let's say at the national level, the government can make people pay something through the tax system. And so the government could provide public goods, and it doesn't require voluntary contributions. But the argument that I made when we considered public goods earlier was that if it depends upon voluntary contributions, people may contribute something, but they're not going to contribute enough to result in an efficient outcome. And this is complicated, of course, because this requires international negotiations, and we've got roughly 200 countries in the world, and each one of them is going to want other ones to bear more of the burden. The free rider problem is actually being actively advocated by many people. Here's an example. This is Peter MacKay, who is running for the leadership of the Conservative Party. And last month, he made this ridiculous statement when he was asked in a public meeting about climate change. He said, "We're not the problem. We can throw all our car keys in Halifax Harbor, turn down the heat, turn off the lights, walk around naked in the dark eating organic beets, and it won't make any difference." So he's saying that a voluntary contribution to this global public good, that is, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, won't make any difference. So why bother? And of course, every other country, pretty well, except for maybe the very largest ones like the United States and China, could make a similar argument. Well, I don't want to be seen to be picking on the Conservative Party. Let's consider this statement here by our Prime Minister. This is just 3 years ago. You can read his statement. The most remarkable and audacious part of this, I'd have to say, is the use of the word sustainably. Really. Canada has the fourth largest oil reserves in the world, after Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. So to say that, as Peter MacKay did, that it makes no difference what we do with those oil reserves is not really too believable. In this case, what Trudeau is saying is, yes, we can dig up all that oil, burn it, and then later we will work on renewable energy. So to be fair to him, in this same talk in Texas in 2017, he went on to say, and I'm quoting him, there will come a day, far off, he said, but inevitable at some point, when traditional energy sources will no longer be needed. And then he went on to say what great stuff Canada was doing in terms of developing better batteries and stuff like that. But he claims that the day is far off when we're going to actually have to stop using fossil fuels in the way that we are now. So essentially we're getting arguments for free riding from our major political parties. They just sort of put it in a different way. So what are our chances of getting a grip on this thing? Well, earlier I mentioned the psychology of climate change, and I gave you a video to look at. One of the most prominent psychologists in the world is Daniel Kahneman, pictured here. He's done a lot of work in the area of behavioral economics, sort of the application of psychology to economic questions. And for that, he was given the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics some years ago. So someone asked him, are we going to get a grip on this climate change problem? And you can see what he says. I'm extremely skeptical. To mobilize people, this has to become an emotional issue. It has to have immediacy and salience. By salience, he means it really needs to grab your attention. A distant, abstract, and disputed threat just doesn't have the necessary characteristics for mobilizing public opinion. So the person asking him questions said, well, suppose you explain to people that, look, people don't think clearly about these kinds of long-term threats. Our brains have evolved to think about immediate threats and to deal with those. But our ancestors did not evolve in an environment in which they had to deal with threats that were, as he says, distant and abstract. Well, he's not optimistic there either. He says no amount of psychological awareness will overcome people's reluctance to lower their standard of living. There's not much hope. I'm thoroughly pessimistic. I'm sorry. Well, I would urge you to listen to the interview with Stiglitz and Stern that I've posted on the website, on the D2L site, because they're trying to make a positive case for dealing with climate change. Instead of saying, well, we're going to have to deal with lowering people's standard of living, they're talking about living in a cleaner and more livable world. They're talking about actions to create a new industrial revolution that will actually not only address the problem of climate change, but will also make life much better for people. And I might just add, incidentally, that's being a little glimpse of that is being seen now, when so much of the economies around the world have essentially shut down or slowed down as a result of the current pandemic, and there's been a collapse in air pollution. And some people have, there have been calculations I read just in the last day or so, that in China alone, more than 50,000 people have been, they've had their lives extended as a result of the sharp decrease in pollution that occurred there. One thing that Kahneman mentions as well here in that first paragraph is he calls it a disputed threat. So I just want to say a word about that. There's a book which I would like to mention to you, called Merchants of Doubt, co-authored by Naomi Oreskes, seen here on the right. She's a professor of the history of science at Harvard University. The book was published in 2014 and was actually made into a documentary movie. I'd suggest that you have a look at the brief video that I posted on D2L, where a couple of former Exxon scientists are being questioned about what Exxon knew in the 1970s and 80s about climate change. They knew a lot, actually. But when the issue started to come to public attention, they and many other fossil fuel companies and other right-wing organizations started funding climate denial campaigns or campaigns to raise doubt about climate science, and in that way to undermine public support for action. So Naomi Oreskes appears very briefly at the end of that video. So I guess the question that we'd have to ask ourselves is this really hopeless? Is Kahneman right? It's hard to predict how people are going to react. I guess the key question is, can this become an emotional issue that people will really act on? Or is it going to be something that's that kind of remains distant and abstract, and that people might accept intellectually, but will not feel motivated to do something to really act? Well, I guess we've seen that some people do get emotional about it and are ready to act, and other people eventually will sit down and join them. And in this particular case, you will recognize Greta Thunberg. Within less than a year, we had scenes like this, where literally millions of people were taking part in demonstrations around the world. So perhaps that's one way of overcoming the free rider problem, or it's certainly going to be an essential part. There'll have to be enough public support and pressure put on the political leadership to carry out effective action, because the established interests, the fossil fuel companies primarily, are going to be putting pressure on politicians to make sure that nothing happens. Another issue for individual countries in imposing Pigovian taxes is the threat to the international competitiveness of domestic industries. So, for example, if you impose a carbon tax and you raise the costs that domestic industry faces, then it may face difficulties in export markets, and it may get outcompeted by imports that are coming from countries that are not taking action. One idea to deal with this has been put forward by William Nordhaus of Yale University, who's done a lot of research on climate change issues. And he's suggesting that countries form what he calls a climate club. And the idea would be that you use tariffs or some kind of trade restrictions to offset the effects of differences between carbon taxes in different countries. So, for example, if imports were coming from a country that had no carbon tax and you had a fairly high carbon tax, then you could tax those imports. And that would be a way of encouraging other countries to stop free riding. Nobody's done this yet, as far as I know, but I've read just recently that the European Union is considering tariffs to protect some of its energy-intensive industries, such as steel production. So we'll see whether that happens and what the response to it is.